George Hendricks owned the Crown Inn, and that night he was certain it would be a complete fiasco. The sounds coming from backstage were horrifying. Someone was throwing up, someone was fighting, someone was crying. This strange band called Black Sabbath was on the verge of every kind of disaster. George checked his watch. They were supposed to go on stage in 15 minutes, but none of them looked ready. In fact, Ozzy, their vocalist, had just tried to run out the door. If Tony hadn't stopped him, rock history would have been written completely differently. Because what happened backstage that night wasn't just about a concert. It was about 4 desperate men whose fates changed forever in a single moment. No one at the Crown Inn in Birmingham that cold January night in 1969 could have predicted that they were witnessing the birth of heavy metal. Not the 30 people in the audience, not the bartender who was convinced this doom rock thing would never catch on, and certainly not George Hendricks, who was already planning to never book this band again. But sometimes history is made in the most unexpected places, by the most unlikely people in the most chaotic circumstances. George Hendricks had been running the Crown Inn for 15 years. He'd seen hundreds of bands come through his small venue in Aston, Birmingham. Most were terrible. Some were decent. A few went on to modest success. But he had a sense for talent, and more importantly, he had a sense for trouble. When a local promoter named Jim Simpson had approached him about booking a new band called Black Sabbath, George had been skeptical. "What kind of name is Black Sabbath?" he'd asked. "Sounds like devil worship." Jim had laughed. "It's from a Boris Karloff film. These guys play heavy blues. Really heavy. I think they've got something." George had reluctantly agreed, mainly because Jim had a decent track record. But now, standing outside the cramped backstage area on January 16, 1969, he was seriously regretting that decision. The first warning sign had come when the band arrived 2 hours early. That seemed promising at first, professionals who wanted time to set up properly. But as George watched them haul their equipment in, he noticed something troubling. Everything was falling apart. The amplifiers had duct tape holding them together. The drum kit looked like it had been through a war. One of the guitar cases had a broken latch and was held shut with rope. "Are you sure this stuff even works?" George had asked Tony Iommi, the guitarist. Tony had given him a dark look. "It'll work," he said tersely. "It has to." As sound check time approached, George noticed the tension building among the 4 band members. They weren't joking around like most young bands did. They weren't excited. They looked terrified. Ozzy Osbourne, the singer, was particularly concerning. He was 20 years old, thin as a rail, with long dark hair and hollow eyes. He kept pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. George had seen stage fright before, but this was different. This kid looked like he was about to have a complete breakdown. Tony Iommi was the opposite, quiet, focused, but with an intensity that bordered on intimidation. He was obsessively checking his guitar, tuning it over and over again. George noticed that Tony's fingertips looked strange, like they had been damaged somehow. Later he'd learn about the factory accident that had cost Tony the tips of 2 fingers on his right hand, the hand he used to fret the guitar. Geezer Butler, the bassist, was tall and lanky with intense eyes. He seemed to be the most grounded of the 4, but George could see the worry etched on his face. He kept checking and rechecking his equipment, clearly not trusting it to work properly. And then there was Bill Ward, the drummer. Bill was already drunk, not tipsy drunk. He had a whiskey bottle in his hand and was taking swigs between setting up his drums. "Liquid courage," he'd said to George, with a crooked smile. But George had been in the music business long enough to know the difference between a celebratory drink and desperate self-medication. When sound check time came, George's worst fears were confirmed. The equipment barely functioned. Geezer's bass amp kept cutting out. Bill's kick drum pedal was squeaking so loudly it was almost comical. And Tony's guitar, despite his constant adjustments, sounded like it was fighting him at every turn. But the real problem was Ozzy. When it came time for him to test the vocals, he could barely get through a single line. His voice cracked. He forgot words. At one point he just stopped completely and walked away from the microphone. George exchanged a worried glance with his bartender, Mike. This was going to be a disaster. As showtime approached, the situation backstage deteriorated rapidly. George tried to give them space, but the walls in the Crown Inn were thin. He could hear everything. First, there was the sound of retching from the small bathroom. Ozzy was throwing up. George heard Tony's voice. "Oz, mate, you've got to pull it together. We go on in 20 minutes. "I can't do this." Ozzy's voice was high-pitched, panicked. "There's too many people out there." "There's 30 people, Oz. 30. "That's 30 too many. I'm not a singer, Tony. I'm a nobody from Aston. Who do we think we are?" George felt a pang of sympathy. He'd heard this kind of self-doubt before, especially from working-class kids who'd been told their entire lives that they weren't good enough for anything. Then came the sound of something breaking. George rushed to the backstage door and peeked in. Tony's guitar strap had snapped. He was staring at the broken leather in his hands with an expression of pure despair. "That's it," Tony said quietly. "That's the universe telling us we're not meant to do this." Geezer was frantically trying to fix the strap with some wire he'd found. "No, it's just a strap. We can fix it. We can fix everything." But even as he said it, Geezer's bass amp emitted a horrible buzzing sound, and then went completely silent. He stared at it, his face going pale. No, 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 no. He kicked the amp. Nothing. He kicked it again. Harder. Still nothing. Bill, who had been sitting on his drum throne, nursing his whiskey bottle, suddenly stood up. But he stood up too fast and immediately stumbled, nearly falling into his drums. "Whoops," he slurred. "Maybe one too many." "Maybe." Geezer shouted. "Bill, you can barely stand. How are you going to play drums?" "I play better when I'm drunk," Bill insisted, but his eyes couldn't quite focus. Tony, still holding the broken guitar strap, suddenly threw it across the room. "This is bullshit. We should never have tried this. We're factory workers, not musicians. We don't have proper equipment. We don't have proper training. We don't have anything." The outburst shocked everyone into silence. Tony Iommi, who was usually so controlled, so focused, had just lost it. And if Tony had lost hope, what chance did the rest of them have? Ozzy emerged from the bathroom, wiping his mouth. His face was pale green. He took one look at the scene. Geezer desperately trying to fix the amp, Bill swaying on his feet, Tony standing amid broken equipment, and made a decision. "I'm out," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "What?" Geezer said. "I'm leaving. I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I just can't." Ozzy started walking toward the exit door. George, still watching from the doorway, saw the whole thing unfold. He saw Tony drop the broken strap and lunge forward, grabbing Ozzy by the arm. "You're not going anywhere," Tony said, his voice low and dangerous. "Let go of me, Tony." "No." Tony pulled Ozzy back into the room. "We're all scared, Oz. Every single one of us is terrified. But we made a promise. We said we'd do this together. But look at us." Ozzy gestured wildly at the chaos around them. "Everything's falling apart. The equipment doesn't work. Bill's too drunk to play. I can't sing. And you just said yourself we're not meant to do this." "I was wrong," Tony said, and the conviction in his voice made everyone stop and listen. "I was wrong, Oz. We are meant to do this, not in spite of everything falling apart, but because of it." Tony's words hung in the air. Even George, still watching from the doorway, felt the weight of them. "What are you talking about?" Geezer asked. Tony let go of Ozzy's arm and looked at each of his bandmates in turn. "Think about it. What kind of music do we play? We play heavy, dark, angry music. Music about pain, about struggle, about life being unfair. And look at us. We're the living embodiment of that." He pointed at his damaged fingers. "I lost my fingertips in a factory accident. I was supposed to give up guitar, but I didn't. I made these." He held up his hand, showing the homemade prosthetic tips he'd fashioned from plastic bottle caps and tape. "I had to relearn everything, retune to make it easier, play in a way no one else plays." He turned to Geezer. "You grew up in a house with no electricity, no running water. You learned bass on an instrument you borrowed because you couldn't afford your own." Geezer nodded slowly, remembering. "Bill!" Tony looked at the drummer. "You've got anxiety so bad you can't function without drinking. But when you're behind those drums, drunk or sober, you play with more power than anyone I've ever heard. Bill's eyes were watering, but he was listening.
Finally, Tony turned to Ozzy. And you, Oz, you can barely read or write because of your dyslexia. You got kicked out of school. You worked in a slaughterhouse because that's the only job you could get. Everyone in Aston told you that you were stupid, that you'd never amount to anything, and now you're scared because you think they might be right.
Ozzy's jaw tightened, but he didn't disagree. But here's the thing, Tony continued. That's exactly why we're going to succeed. Not in spite of all this shit, but because of it. Every other band out there is playing music about love, about peace, about sunshine and flowers. But we know the truth. We know that life is hard. We know what it's like to struggle. And there are millions of people out there who know it too. They're waiting for someone to make music that reflects their reality. That's us. We're not pretty. We're not polished. We're not perfect. But we're real. George found himself nodding along. He'd never heard it put quite that way before. But Tony was right. There was something authentic about these four misfits that all the polished professionals lacked.
Geezer was the first to respond. He picked up a screwdriver and started working on his amp again. "Okay," he said. "Okay, let's do this."
Bill set down his whiskey bottle. He sat back at his drum kit and started doing some practice rolls. The squeaky kick pedal was still squeaky, but somehow it sounded defiant now, like it was daring anyone to say it wasn't good enough. Tony started rigging his guitar strap back together with the wire Geezer had found. It wasn't pretty, but it would hold. Everyone looked at Ozzy. He stood there, still pale, still scared, but something in his eyes had changed. "If I throw up on stage," he said, "I'm blaming all of you." Tony grinned. Fair enough. George chose that moment to knock on the door and enter properly. "You guys about ready? You're on in 5. The 4 members of Black Sabbath looked at each other. They weren't ready. Not even close, but they nodded anyway. "One more thing," Tony said, gathering them into a huddle. "Whatever happens out there, we don't stop. Equipment fails, we keep playing. Ozzy forgets the words, we keep playing. No matter what goes wrong, we see it through to the end. Together. Agreed?" "Agreed," they said in unison. George led them out of the backstage area and toward the stage entrance. As they walked, he could feel the nervous energy radiating off them. But there was something else too, something he hadn't felt from them before: determination. The Crown Inn wasn't much to look at. It was a small, dingy pub in one of Birmingham's roughest neighborhoods. The stage was really just a slightly elevated platform in the corner. The PA system was barely functional. The lighting consisted of a few colored bulbs that George had rigged up himself. And the audience? 30 people, maybe 35. Most of them were friends and family who'd been guilted into attending. A few were locals who'd wandered in for a pint and happened to stay. Nobody was expecting anything special. George watched from behind the bar as Black Sabbath took the stage. They looked exactly like what they were: 4 terrified working-class kids who were in way over their heads. Ozzy gripped the microphone stand like it was the only thing keeping him from falling over. Geezer kept his eyes down, focused on his bass. Bill positioned himself behind the drums, his face already sweating, and Tony stood with his damaged fingers poised over the guitar strings, his expression unreadable. There was a moment of silence. The audience's conversations died down. Everyone waited, and then Tony hit the first note. It wasn't like anything George had ever heard before. It was heavy, not just loud heavy. It felt like the sound had weight to it, like it was pressing down on the room. The note was low, ominous, unsettling. It didn't sound like music for dancing or background entertainment. It sounded like a warning. Then Geezer's bass came in, doubling Tony's riff. The combination created a wall of sound that was both fascinating and frightening. Bill's drums kicked in with a thunderous crash, and suddenly the room was filled with noise unlike anything that had ever been played in the Crown Inn. And then Ozzy started to sing. His voice was raw, untrained, but there was something in it, something desperate and real. He wasn't trying to sound pretty or professional. He was just trying to be heard, and somehow that made it more powerful than any technically perfect vocalist could have achieved. George noticed something happening in the audience. People weren't dancing. They weren't even moving much. They were just standing there, transfixed. Some looked confused, some looked uncomfortable, but all of them were paying attention. The song later George George would learn it was called Black Sabbath. The band's namesake was like nothing that had come before it. Where other bands played fast, they played slow. Where others went for major keys and uplifting melodies, they went for minor keys and dark, foreboding progressions. It was blues, but blues filtered through the experience of industrial Birmingham. Blues that had been beaten down and emerged angry. Then, midway through the song, disaster struck. Geezer's amp, which had been barely functioning before, completely gave out. The bass disappeared from the mix. George saw Geezer's face go white. This was it. This was where everything fell apart. But Tony had said no matter what, they wouldn't stop. And true to his word, Geezer kept playing. Even though no one could hear him, he played every note with complete commitment. And somehow, his physical presence, his movement, the way he was locked in with the drums, made the absence of his sound almost imperceptible to the audience. Tony saw what was happening and adjusted. He started playing his guitar parts lower, filling in some of the frequencies where the bass should have been. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. The song continued, and as it did, something magical began to happen. The confusion on the audience members' faces started to transform into something else. Recognition, maybe, understanding. These weren't teenagers playing at rebellion. These were people who actually understood what it meant to struggle. When the song ended, there was a moment of silence. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else. Within seconds, the whole room was applauding. It wasn't thunderous. There were only 35 people after all. But it was genuine. Ozzy, who had been gripping the microphone stand in terror, looked up in surprise. They liked it. Against all odds, they actually liked it. George saw Tony look at his bandmates, a small smile crossing his face. Then he counted them into the next song. Black Sabbath played for 45 minutes that night. Equipment malfunctioned. Bill nearly fell off his drum throne twice. Ozzy forgot lyrics and had to improvise, but they kept going. They kept playing, and the audience, small as it was, stayed for every minute of it. When they finished their set and walked off stage, they were drenched in sweat, physically exhausted, and emotionally drained. But they were also exhilarated in a way none of them had ever experienced before. George met them backstage with beers. Well, he said, that was different. Different good or different bad? Geezer asked nervously. George thought about it. Different, important, he finally said. I don't know if that's what people want to hear, but I think it might be what they need to hear. The band members looked at each other, not quite believing what they'd just accomplished. They had survived. More than that, they had actually done something worth doing. Jim Simpson, the promoter who'd booked them, came backstage with a huge grin on his face. Did you see how people were reacting? They didn't know what to make of you at first, but by the end, they were hooked. This is something new. This is something real. But my amp died, Geezer protested. We sounded like shit. No, Jim corrected him. You sounded raw. You sounded honest. And in a world full of polished crap, that's refreshing. Over the next hour, as they packed up their broken equipment, several audience members approached them. Most didn't know what to say. That was intense, was the common refrain. But a few got it immediately. One young guy, barely 20, came up to Ozzy. Mate, where did that come from? That sound, those lyrics about fear and darkness, that's what life actually feels like when you're broke and stuck in Birmingham with no future. Ozzy, still shy, just nodded. But George could see the impact those words had on him. Someone understood. Someone got what they were trying to say. As the band finally prepared to leave, George stopped Tony at the door. You want to come back next month? I can give you a Friday night slot. Tony looked surprised. Really? After everything that went wrong? Everything went wrong, George agreed. But you didn't let it stop you. And that matters more than perfect equipment or perfect performance. You've got something, Tony. All of you. I don't know what it is exactly, but it's worth developing. Tony shook his hand. We'll be here. George Hendricks would book Black Sabbath 6 more times over the next year. Each time the audience grew larger. Each time the band got tighter, more confident, but they never lost that raw, desperate energy that had defined their first performance. Years later, after Black Sabbath had become world famous, after they'd defined an entirely new genre of music, reporters would ask George George about that first show. He always told them the same thing. I thought it was going to be a disaster. And in a way, it was. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But they didn't let that stop them. And that's the difference between people who dream about being musicians and people who actually become legends. The story of that first night became part of rock folklore. Ozzy would tell it in interviews, usually focusing on his own terror and the moment he tried to run away. Tony would talk about how close they came to giving up, how easy it would have been to let the broken equipment and technical problems become an excuse to quit. But the real lesson of that night wasn't about perseverance or determination, though those were certainly part of it. The real lesson was about authenticity. Black Sabbath succeeded not by trying to be like other bands, not by polishing their rough edges or hiding their working-class roots. They succeeded by embracing all of it: the poverty, the broken equipment, the fear, the anger, the desperation, and turning it into art. Music historians would later point to that January night in 1969 as the birth of heavy metal. The combination of down-tuned guitars, Tony's adaptation to his damaged fingers, thunderous drums, dark lyrics, and that overall sense of heaviness and doom. It was all there from the very beginning, but it wasn't calculated or planned. It emerged organically from four young men who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. The Crown Inn itself would close in 1985, torn down to make room for a car park. But by then, its place in rock history was secure. Plaques were installed, documentaries were filmed, pilgrims came from around the world to stand where the venue had once been and imagine what it must have been like to witness the birth of heavy metal. George Hendrix, in his later years, would be interviewed countless times about that night. He became something of a minor celebrity himself, the man who gave Black Sabbath their first real chance. But he always insisted it wasn't about him. I just owned a pub, he'd say. They're the ones who had the courage to get up on that stage when everything was falling apart. They're the ones who created something new when they could have just given up. I just happened to be there to watch it happen. But George was selling himself short, because venue owners, bookers, and gatekeepers make choices every day about who gets a chance and who doesn't. George could have canceled the show when he saw how unprepared they were. He could have banned them from ever returning after all the technical problems, but he didn't. He saw something in them that night, something raw and real and important, and he gave them the space to develop it. In 2005, the surviving members of Black Sabbath, Ozzy, Tony, and Geezer, Bill Ward, was dealing with health issues, did a small secret show in Birmingham to celebrate the 35th anniversary of their first album. Only a few hundred people attended, mostly industry insiders and longtime fans. But they didn't play in some modern arena or fancy club. They specifically chose a small venue in Aston, less than a mile from where the Crown Inn had once stood. And before they played their first song, Ozzy addressed the audience. 36 years ago, he said, his voice rough with age, but still strong. We played our first show as Black Sabbath at a pub called the Crown Inn. Everything went wrong that night. I was terrified. Tony's equipment was broken. Geezer's amp died in the middle of a song. Bill was so drunk he nearly fell off his drum stool. We were a disaster. The audience laughed, but Ozzy's expression was serious. But we didn't give up. And the reason we didn't give up was because of people like George Hendrix, who owned that pub, and Jim Simpson, who believed in us, and those 35 people who came to that first show and gave us a chance. They didn't expect perfection. They just wanted something real. And that's what we tried to give them. He paused, looking out at the crowd. So this first song tonight, we're playing it for everyone who was there that night in 1969. For everyone who gave us a chance when we were nobody. This is Black Sabbath. And as Tony hit that first heavy, ominous note, the same note that had announced the birth of heavy metal 36 years earlier, everyone in that room understood they weren't just listening to a band. They were witnessing history, acknowledging its own humble, chaotic, beautiful beginning. George Hendrix had passed away in 2003, but his daughter was in that audience. When the song ended, she was crying, After the show, Ozzy found her. "Your father gave us our start," he told her. "We never forgot that. Never." She hugged him, this rock legend who had once been so terrified he tried to run away from a 30-person crowd. "He never stopped talking about that first night," she said. "He said he knew immediately you were going to be something special." "Did he really?" Ozzy asked, surprised. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like a complete disaster." She smiled. "That's what made it special. You weren't trying to be perfect. You were just trying to be real. And that's what the world needed." The story of Black Sabbath's first concert, with all its chaos, fear, broken equipment, and unlikely triumph, has been told and retold countless times over the decades. It's been exaggerated in some versions, minimized in others, but the core truth remains. Four working-class kids from Birmingham, with everything against them, decided not to give up. And in that decision, in that moment backstage when Tony convinced Ozzy to stay, when they all chose to see it through despite the disasters, they changed music forever. Today, heavy metal is a global phenomenon. Millions of bands have followed in Black Sabbath's footsteps, building on the foundation they laid that cold January night in 1969. Some are more technically proficient, some have better equipment, some are more successful commercially, but none of them can claim to have done what Black Sabbath did, create an entirely new genre of music, while everything was literally falling apart around them. That takes more than talent or skill. It takes courage. It takes authenticity, and it takes the willingness to embrace your imperfections and turn them into strengths. If this story inspired you, if it reminded you that success doesn't require perfection, that authenticity trumps polish, and that the most important moments often happen when everything seems to be going wrong, share it. Because somewhere right now there's someone who's afraid to try because they don't think they're good enough, because their equipment isn't perfect, because everything seems to be falling apart, and they need to know that Ozzy Osbourne once threw up before his first show. Tony Iommi played guitar with damaged fingers and broken equipment, and Black Sabbath created heavy metal on a night when absolutely nothing went according to plan. Your imperfections aren't obstacles, they're your story, and your story is worth telling.